Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Boston.com book club event with W.S. Winslow, featuring her debut novel, The Northern Reach. My name is Stephanie Hines, and I'm the children's manager and community coordinator at Print a Bookstore, an independent bookstore in Portland, Maine. Just as a reminder to everyone before we dive in, Wendy will be answering some questions after and during our conversation. If you look down to the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A function. You can submit your questions there if you would like to ask some questions of our author. Also, as a reminder, you can purchase signed copies of The Northern Reach from Print's website. I'm going to drop a link in the chat right now for you to check that out. Now, without any further ado, it is my honor to introduce tonight's author. W.S. Winslow was born and raised in Maine, but spent her working life in Boston, New York, and San Francisco. A ninth-generation Mainer, she now lives in a small town down east. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in French from the University of Maine and an MFA from NYU. Her work has appeared in LitHub, Electric Lit, Yamasee Journal, and Bird's Thumb. Her first novel, The Northern Reach, was published by Flatiron Books in 2021. Wendy, would you like to set the stage by telling us a little bit more about your novel and reading a short excerpt?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. That was very nice. I will set the stage, I guess, first, and then read you just a couple of pages, not to drag it on for too long. My novel, The Northern Reach, is actually what's called a novel in stories. It takes place in one very tiny town on the down east coast of Maine, which is off the tourist track. So it's not the picture postcard part of Maine. It's but it's there, despite the fact that it's a fictional town. Um, the the book itself covers the entire sweep of the 20th century from about 1904 to almost the present, 2017 or so, and it involves several families, primarily in the town, and they're all kind of intertwined and intermarried. They know each other, they like each other, they don't like each other. And it's really a book about people as place and a place as the people who live there. And it interrogates questions of what kind of people come out of a certain place, and also not so much what people do, but why they do it. That's what really interests me and what I was trying to think about when I was writing it. So that's kind of the top line view. And what I will do, I think now, is read you just a couple of pages so that for those of you who have read it, you may recognize this section. Those of you who haven't, it'll at least give you a little bit of a flavor for what I'm getting at. This is a chapter called Striptease, and it is set in 1999. Imelda Levine was 3 years old the first time they put her in a straitjacket. It wasn't because she was crazy. That didn't happen until much later. No, her initial experience with restraints was the result of eating an entire bottle of orange-flavored baby aspirin for breakfast one sleety February morning in 1940. The tablets tasted like candy. Medication was on Imelda's mind as she crossed the Walmart parking lot with her brand new prescription. She was remembering how her mother always said she had been saved from the overdose that day, not so much by the hospital staff as by her aunt, Agnes Juke, whom the family had always called Pug on account of her flat nose and bony calves. It was Pug who rushed Imelda to the doctor, while in the back seat, Mama continued to try, unsuccessfully, to bring up the contents of the child's otherwise empty stomach by ramming her nicotine-stained fingers down Imelda's throat. What with all the speeding and ramming and screaming, by the time they got little Imelda on the examining table, she was too hysterical to thread the stomach pump hose down her throat, hence the straitjacket. Imelda couldn't recall the event, but Pug had told her the story often enough that the memory had created itself in her imagination, and since then she had occasionally watched it, movie-like, in her mind's eye, which was what she was doing as she approached her car. Imelda slid into the driver's seat and grunted with the effort of closing the heavy door. then grabbed the family-sized bag of cheese doodles she just bought and shoved it between her stomach and the steering wheel. After undoing the top button on her blouse, she poured out half of her Dunkin' Donuts sweet tea, topped it up with the vodka she kept in the glove compartment, and gave the Go Cup a festive swirl before taking a long pull through the straw. Now that's tea worth drinking, she said to herself as she slipped the cup into the plastic holder that was wedged into the window channel of the driver's side door. In 1970, when her butter yellow convertible DeVille came off the assembly line, it featured an 8-track tape deck, stereophonic sound, white leather seats, power everything, and enough horses to launch a moonshot, but no place to put a drink, which was, in Imelda's opinion, the car's only flaw. She'd taken the caddy off Edwin Brass after his third DUI, trading him a set of dragoon-sized pepperbox revolvers and a bird's-eye maple brake front of questionable provenance. She missed haggling in her little antique shop, but lacked the stamina to keep it open anymore. If there was one thing Imelda had always enjoyed, it was the freedom that came with dropping the top on her caddy and sipping a cocktail while taking a drive on an Indian summer day like this, one that almost made her believe the beautiful lie about how the cruel winter might never come, might never turn the red and yellow leaves the color of dried blood, then pull them from the trees, leaving them black and slick as they decomposed like rotting corpses littering the ground below. And on that happy note, I will stop.
Thank you for sharing. I think I wanted to start with, as you said, that happy note. Something that we had talked about a little bit before was the very unique brand that is known as Maine humor. In particular, it is often thought to other people as maybe not jokes. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your understanding of this kind of historical sense of humor in this state and kind of how that ties in culturally, both in your experiences and how you wove it throughout your book. Because at base level, looking at your book, a lot of sad, distressing things happen, but there are moments of humor. There are very engaging, very funny scenes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad we can talk about that a little bit. The humor that I grew up surrounded by here was very dry. It was very dark, and it was at times, not always, but at times, and it was often invoked. I think when the subject at hand got to be a little bit too much, and I for certainly for me and for a lot of people I know, that kind of humor is a real coping mechanism. It's a deflective, it's a kind of a deflective act of, oh, maybe we don't want to go there. And it is, and I think there's an element of self-protection in there as well. You are sort of protecting yourself by denying the thing that frightens you or makes you sad or makes you angry or makes you upset. So there is that, and it is sort of a self-preservation instinct, I think. And I think it also end runs conflict, and end running conflict is something that Maine people do often do. Certainly, it's a very it's a sort of one of the straggling legacies of Puritanism that we live in, we live with here. And, the state's become much more diverse and much more interesting and open, certainly in my lifetime. But there are a lot of remnants of that original sort of 18th century cultural domination of a sort of white Protestant, very rigid Puritan establishment or theft, actually, of the state from the people who are here. Depends on how well, I think there's only one way to look at it. But in any case, I do think that Maine humor is very droll and it's very dry. And I think, it's doubly impactful when it comes from the delivery is very deadpan quite often. And that's a little bit hard to capture in writing because it is something that you hear, but it's important, and it's a really important part, I think, of this place as a place, and these people as part of this place. It's important. It's an important part of the culture that we don't think about too much. We
Yeah.
don't really think about it, I think.
And I think especially what you said about how humor is used as a protection, as a distancing, and a lot of times I think it's so interesting to consider that while also looking at kind of Maine and its historic or kind of cultural view of outsiders, where I always hear the fact being like, oh, you're not a real Mainer unless your grandparents were born here and your parents were born here and you were born here. Like there's this sense of identity, and I feel like that can kind of tie into this idea of trying to protect something and protect what something is, especially when you're dealing with a lot of small towns where people have lived in these areas for generations, even as you acknowledged, it was not their land to take it first. They now feel like there is a claim there, and there's that legacy of it. Do you think that kind of ties in together, that sense of trying to define yourself as, oh, I am a Mainer, oh, I am a part of this small town, and having it be a form of protection?
I think so. And, it's a funny thing because that you ask it that way, because I think about this a lot. I think about the notion of belonging to something larger than yourself. And certainly everyone experiences belonging in a different way. Um, when I was a kid, it began at a very sort of like granular level of I'm part of this family, this immediate family, and this larger family, and this neighborhood, and this town, and this church, and this school, and this state, and this region, and this country. It just, there were layers and layers and layers of belonging, and that those layers of belonging came from commonality. um, they weren't so much, there weren't a lot of differences to bridge. We all spoke the same language. We all sort of had the same kind of cultural legacy. And it was very solid. It was quite limited. It was very narrow in a certain sense. But there was a sort of level of belonging and common understanding and um, common experience. And I think humor, of course, is a part of that. I mean, sometimes, I mean, there are people who have said, well, some of the humor is, I find it a little offensive. Well, yeah, that's because it is. I mean, it can be. It can be. Um, but that's the truth of the situation, or that's my truth of the situation. Um, and I think the sort of Bert and I stereotype of Maine humor, I think it's all very good and it's fine and it's true in its own way, but there's a much, much darker underside to it. And I think it's important to look at that. I really do. And what's been interesting to me as I returned to Maine as an adult, I mean, I think the last time I lived here, I was probably 27. And so, returning here 30 years later, more, it's a changed place. It's a very, very changed place. I went to Portland High School. And I graduated from Portland High School. And now there are something like 40 languages that students speak. That's remarkable. That's remarkable. And so I'm curious to watch as this kind of insular system of belonging and system of self-identification, if that changes and how that changes. And I'm assuming it's going to change things for the better.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting too, looking at that concept of being where you were. And as you said, like as you get older, your understanding of the world and how you identify expands beyond, I apologize for my noisy puppy, expands beyond the singular and then the familial and then the community. And there's often, as comes up with some of the characters in your book, this desire to leave those places and to get away from them and to no longer define yourself from your roots. But as something that also comes up in the book and came up in your own life, sometimes you return to those places. Sometimes it's by choice and other times it's just by situation. And I'm curious to talk a little bit more about that experience and what interests you in the idea of returning to roots.
Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of returning to roots. I'm also interested in the idea of running away, and why do people do leave. They leave everyone they've known, the place where they've grown up, the place where they've always lived, and they go someplace else. I mean, in my case, was someplace radically different, New York City. Um, uh, you know, and it sort of harkens back to the question of, it's interesting to watch what people do, but what's really interesting is why they do it. And I think what I tried to talk about a little bit is the notion of place and being deeply, deeply dug in, rooted in a place. And then, there are characters in the book who leave. And there are characters who come back, whether it's to the town or the state or um, whatever that is. So the question is, why leave? Why leave? And I think it's not so much the place as it is your particular situation. Sometimes it's growing up in an alcoholic family, or there's mental illness in the family. There's a desire to flee. For some, it's an issue of sort of social stigma. There's one character who, is just really tired of having, carrying around the name of, the no the town's no count family. Just doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And that's an interesting thing, because it's about your identity. Who are you? Because you are, I mean, anyone who spends enough time as a child in a place is really of that place. And everything leaves a mark on you, you know, uh, everything. And so the question about why people leave and why do they pull up their roots, and how far do you ever really get? How far away do you really ever get? Because what people are, I think in this book, and I find in life, people are sometimes running from something that's situational, but they're also sometimes running from themselves. And of course, as we know, no matter where you go, you have to take yourself with you, and you take it. And when you take you yourself pack up and go someplace, you take everything with you, whether you want to or not. You just take it and you just put it somewhere else. So I think that there is I certainly have experienced, and I know many people have experienced, what I think of as the push pull of place. It's your home, and it pulls you and it draws you, and it can consume you. But then there's a moment where you push it away and say, you know what, I may not be the the person who can make a life here, or I do not want to make a life here, or there are plenty of people who never even occurs to them to leave. Like, why would you leave? Why would you go anywhere? This is great. That's fine. Everybody's here.
Yeah,
My store, my sister's down the road.
it's funny. The other day, one of the coders, Josh, and I were talking about, relates back, I promise, but like security questions that you have for like password recovery, and how so many of them are like, oh, like where were you born, and this, that, and the other thing, and how we like those because they're easy and they're a solid answer and it never changes where you came from. But then also statistically, like they're not actually good recovery questions, because apparently like 30% of people pretty much never leave the town they were born.
Really?
I think that's amazing when you consider the fact that there is this huge world out there, and there is a very large portion of people who stay where they began, and sometimes they are very content and very happy with that situation. Other times, resentment grows. And I think all of that kind of ties into this sense of inheritance and legacy. And it's not just the physical things that you get, like you've inherited the family house, or you have to potentially even inherit in the sense of you now take care of elders in your family, but also, as you said, those things that you always take with you, even if you're trying to leave everything behind, you still have the legacy of maybe trauma or of culture and heritage that you're bringing with you.
Yeah. That's a really good point, because that ties into the notion of being haunted. I mean, some people are not at all haunted by their past, and some people are very haunted by the past. And that is why I think I found, like for me, the image of a ghost, and
Mhm.
there are ghosts in several stories, and sometimes it's not entirely clear whether they're real or not, and that's intentional, because we are all haunted by something. I think. I mean, maybe not, but I've never known anyone who wasn't somewhat haunted by something. And quite often that comes, that comes from family, but it can come from your experience or your place or your mind, and the notion of being haunted is interesting because of course you carry it with you.
Mhm.
That's another one of the things that you carry with you no matter where you go. You take your ghosts. They just come.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you can try and tell yourself, I don't need that stuff. I don't want to engage with that stuff. But if you just completely try and shut it out, there will always be that part of you that maybe hasn't fully processed it yet. And I feel like that is definitely evident in a number of the characters in this book, that there are things that they don't want to look at, but that doesn't make it go away.
No, it's the unburied past.
Mhm. Something else that I wanted to bring up too, that actually popped into my head when you were doing your excerpt, because you'd mentioned the aunt who was always referred to as Pug, and there's a couple other characters that have nicknames that they're very much known by, and then there's also the character of Lilian, who is French and is now living in this small town, and her in-laws insist on referring to her as Liliane, a very Americanized version of her name, in a way of kind of highlighting the fact that she's an outsider.
Yeah.
I just found your usage of names very interesting and very compelling. Could you talk a little bit more about how you picked these names for your characters?
Yeah. Well, a lot of them come out of my family. Um, um, the that's an interesting thing, and it is something I have actually seen people do, which is they meet someone who has a name that they've never encountered, and they just default to the closest equivalent that they already have. Like my father's mother used to refer to my husband as Mac, although his name is Max, but she had never known a Max, and it was a little foreign sounding, so she just called him Mac. I mean, this just goes on and on. It happens all the time. So, I mean, some of it is sort of the product of a sort of narrow worldview, but names are interesting, and as we have certainly learned in the last 5 years or so, name calling is a very powerful way to other somebody, to really make someone feel like they are other and they do not belong, and you do not want them here. And so, by having this woman who was, whose name was Liliane, which is not something you would expect people to be able to pronounce if they don't speak the language, but then just sort of calling her Lillian and going, yeah, Lillian, it's nasty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a subject that's, I mean, this particular story was set in 1967, but it's nothing new, and it hasn't gone away. I mean, this notion of othering people by somehow making a point of differentiating that they are different, that they are not part of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very common. We see it a lot. So, we live, but we don't learn necessarily. We don't learn as much as we should.
No, and it's, I feel like names also tie so much back into the idea of legacy, the idea of inheritance, the things you bring with you, especially with both first names are often passed down to people, and your last name as well. As you mentioned, there's certainly at least one character in particular who feels very strongly about distancing themselves from the idea of their family and where they came from. And obviously, people can choose their own name, especially people who are non-binary and transgender find a name that identifies with them. And I think that's something that's been really interesting to me, having a number of friends who are in the process of that right now, is that they are thinking very intentionally about what they are called and how that presents itself, and
Yeah.
how for so many people they never take that opportunity to be like, no, like this name isn't me, but this idea and this sound says something about me that I want to identify myself with. And I just find that fascinating.
It's interesting how you choose to present yourself to the world,
Yeah.
whether you actually sort of actively seek attention, whether you find that just deflecting is much more comfortable. Certainly, any writer will tell you that this is much better. Um, but yeah, there are questions about how you are perceived in the world, and whether you care. I mean,
Mhm.
for many years, you know, having any kind of foreign last name in Maine, certainly when I was a child coming up, even French last names, which, there were lots of people of French Canadian origin here. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And, there was a persistence of not pronouncing their name right. Like,
Mhm.
no, 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 it happens. And it's not new. I'd like to think it's getting better, but I don't necessarily think that it is. And that's it. It's interesting, because it plays with the notion of judgment, how you judge yourself, how you perceive others judge you, and whether you care.
Mhm. And I think too, as you said, that perception and that changing of perception, I think, is so interesting. And I feel like one of the most striking examples of that in the book for me was when you look at the Baines sisters, and the first time when they are a little bit older, talking about Erlene, who marries into the Moody family, the kind of rowdy, no good family in town. The two sisters are talking about her in a way, being like, oh, like she's awful, she's getting into these terrible things, and really like painting this kind of disastrous view of her. And then once you get to one of the other stories that you're actually spending more time with her from her perspective, all of a sudden, like, you start seeing her as this very different type of character. And by the end of the book, I was just like, out of all of the characters in the book, I'm like, I feel like she's the one who would be like, I want her on my side, like,
Yeah,
because she
yeah,
is perceived in a certain way, and maybe those perceptions, there are truth to them, but she also feels like one of the most genuine characters.
yeah. She's probably among my favorite characters that I've ever written. I just really like her a lot, and she does give a sort of moral center to the
Mhm.
book, in that she's not a perfect person, but she is a genuine person, and she's a strong person, and that strong. I like strong women. I like strong women characters. I grew up surrounded by really strong women. I am to this day surrounded by very strong women, and quite often that gets it gets sort of packaged as difficult, which of course, as we know, is not a term anybody ever uses about men. They don't ever say, "Oh, he's a very difficult man," or like, whatever. But I do love that. I love that about her. And I would point out to you that of all the families in this book, the Moody's are the only ones who have any fun. They're really the only ones who like each other. They're the only ones that have a good time.
No, and as we'd both shared a little bit earlier, we both have quite large families, and I feel like that energy captured there of the fact being like, yeah, maybe not everyone's going to get along all the time, but like there is that sense of community amongst these family members where they're like, you're still mine, and nothing is going to change the fact that you're mine, and I feel strongly about that.
Yeah,
And there is that celebratory aspect versus so many of the other characters, so many of the other families feel like they're constantly trying to distance them from each other or trying to prove that they're better than someone else.
right, right.
Was that
Yeah,
was that a very like conscious decision for you of having those different terms and relationships?
yeah, absolutely. That was a very conscious decision. I like the Moody's.
Mm-hmm.
I love a big personality. I love a great, big, loud personality. I don't know. They fascinate me. They're fun. There's just always a good time to be had, and you know, I like that. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
like that a lot. I think they inject a certain amount of sanity, which you wouldn't kind of take from their stories and their position, but they do. There's a certain sanity in the town from them, and largely I think because they disrupt.
Hmm.
You're disruptive, and that's good. Disruptive is good.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also a layer too of when you already have a reputation of being the big personality or being maybe the wild one or whatnot. Like you're not as focused on, okay, how are people perceiving me? You're just going, I'm going to do what I want to do because people are going to say what they're going to say anyway.
Yeah.
Versus so many of these other characters have a lot of different moments where they're like, I want to do this thing but I can't, or I want to have this relationship but I can't pursue it. I'm limited by this thing. Versus they are very much just, no, we are who we are and that's okay. Like
Yeah.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I understand it. And a good place to spend cocktail hour.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Something kind of that I also wanted to touch on too, tying into that sense of perception, is that in a number of the chapters, while it's never necessarily the focus of moments, there is the historical thread of organizations such as the KKK popping up in these very small town Maine spaces, as it was throughout the country. And I always just thought it was interesting the way that other characters would talk about that group, where there was a number of characters who I didn't necessarily get the sense that they felt strongly about the belief system that the KKK had, but they saw them as an organization of power for the time. And so they would align themselves in different ways. And now, obviously, looking at the understanding that we have now, and you would hope anyone who had any common sense at that time would realize that they're a terrible organization to align themselves with. But I just thought it was interesting, that type of perception of power that popped up. And I feel like there was a smaller aspect of that perception of power on family bases as well. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how that plays into the narrative.
Well, yeah, I mean, we live in, it's interesting how hierarchical a society we live in. And, the thing about it is that, people like to feel better than other people. They just do. I mean, not everyone, but, people do. And that, that was an ugly chapter, certainly, in the state's history and the country's history. And there were a lot of other things going on. But it was an ugly thing. And the interesting thing is that the object of the Klan's um, activities in Maine, were Catholic immigrants. I mean, that was really it. They particularly didn't like French Canadian immigrants because they also, spoke French instead of English. They didn't like Irish immigrants. They didn't. There were even Italians in Maine at that time. They also had a hard time. And of course, if there had been a sizable African American community, they'd have gone after them. They, as it was, they went after whoever happened to be around, but the interesting thing is that it fell out of favor very quickly, and it did because there were right-thinking people who just said, no, you know what, these people are morons, and this is just stupid, and we're not doing this. There was in Northeast Harbor, the Klan got a little foothold, and this was a long time ago in the 20s, and the local people, kind of said, oh, I don't know, whatever. And as they got more and more virulent in their hatred for local Catholics, the local people kind of banded together and helped to complete building of the Catholic Church in Northeast Harbor. And then they all they somehow all signed either the cornerstone or a document or something saying, we were here and we did this and we did this all together. So that's encouraging, and there are right thinking people, and there have always been right thinking people to stand up and just say, no, no, no.
Sometimes you wish that they were just a little bit louder.
Yeah.
And I know we have some questions that people had sent in, and of course, a reminder to everyone to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask some questions as well. But before we dive into those, I did want to ask a little bit, since we've been focusing a little bit more on theme and history and legacy and story, I was curious to talk a little bit about craft as well, namely in the fact that you wrote this novel and stories spanning multiple generations with a huge family tree. Why in the world do it's like I'm so glad you did, but I just makes me wonder what made you sit there and go, I have the confidence to do this.
Know nothing, fear nothing, as my grandfather used to say. It was the first thing I ever wrote, and um, I did want to sort of work within a historical novel space, but I didn't want to write 600 pages,
Mhm.
and I'm not a historian, and I am a little bit compulsive about details. So I knew that if I got into that rabbit hole, I would never get out, and I would never get the book written. And also, it can be a little paralyzing, I think, the the idea that you might not know everything about it, and so then someone will catch you, and you'll have a problem. So I felt like in these smaller bites, I mean, for me, just in from a craft perspective, it was much easier to get a handle on a particular period and stay there for the duration of the story. Understand, the basic sort of historical parameters, what was going on, what movies were people seeing, how did they talk, what did they wear, what did they eat? I mean, I don't know, just you can just do such a deep dive that you never come out again, just looking at 1918, right? So um, there was that, and I it's historical in a certain sense, but it's this the focus is so tight on this particular place that you can't really get overly involved in how the world was working at the time. I mean, you want to know who's president and things like that. So for me, it was actually a very manageable form. And what it started out as a collection of short stories, and I got the first two done, and I began to sort of find that there were a lot of thematic repetitions. There were issues that showed up in one and then showed up in another, and I would see a character and then I would think, well, I want to find out what happens to their children. And so in this way of taking a very very narrow, very personalized view of history, people as history, place in history, and how that all works together, I just found it was for me, and this is just the way probably just the way my mind works. It was good to sort of zoom in tight
Mhm.
and see something, and then move on to the next, and not have to fill in the blanks of the intervening 20 years. It just I don't know. It just worked better for me. That said, it required mind-boggling charts, and it was very complicated, and it also required some really good editing at the end, because at a certain beyond a certain point you just can't remember anything. And it also um my friend Robin, who's an information designer and who is a brilliant person, um, took all my scribbled notes on the family trees and sort of made them into the one big chart and all the smaller ones. And I felt like, okay, so now we know who we're looking at and what we're dealing with in this moment. And I think it helped me to kind of stay in the moment. And I hope that for readers, it is a lot of characters, and it is a lot of time, and it is a lot of moving back and forth. But but to just take the moment and say, this is this moment in this place, and this is this moment in this person's life. And I know some things that have gone before, but I don't necessarily know everything. But I just want to stay in this moment.
And while you were drafting, I know you said that it didn't necessarily start as, oh, okay, this is all set in one continuous storyline. But were you writing chronologically? Were you jumping around? Did you find that all of a sudden you wrote a story that took place in 1984, and oh wait, that would have implications of this story that I already wrote that happened before, and having to go back and fix details.
Yeah, I jumped. I'm a jumper. Yeah, I did. I jumped around a lot. So there was a lot to kind of there was a lot to keep track of, and it just you figure out your own way. I tried 3 or 4 different ways, and that was this one way that worked was just to have this incredibly long, this 5 foot long chart that had a year. Every year was was a box, and then every life was on the chart here or here, and then all the historical stuff was at the bottom. So what I could do is draw a line down the chart and see exactly where everybody was, whether someone had been born, whether they had died, whether they had children, and that was kind of how I kept it. But it's crowded in here.
Oh yeah. It's kind of neat too, because it makes me think of how I'm a very big fan of tabletop role-playing games, just like D&D and a bunch of other systems, and those DMs who have the dungeon masters who are running the games who have like very involved histories. I feel like they have to have a similar thing where they're like, okay, so they're focusing on this right now, but I also have to know what like that kingdom over there is doing and what that like wizard over there is doing, where in a surface level, like a fantasy campaign and your historical novel about small town Maine, like can seem very different, but I can understand how storytelling elements can carry through of needing to
Yeah.
see that bigger picture the whole time, which I always find fascinating. So yeah, so we do have a couple of questions that people had sent in advance. If you don't mind me sharing some of those now. So Pamela Herrick had asked, how did your characters turn up in your earliest concept of this book? And how did you navigate writing about your neighbors and family histories in a small community?
Um, they kind of came in dribs and drabs. I would say some of them are, I mean, many characters are based on people I know. That's the beginning of the character. It's just the sort of the kernel, and then the characters tend to grow far beyond um, the known people and often become somebody else entirely. But characters come to me from a lot of places. They come from my family. They come from my friends. They come from stories. I have known some amazing storytellers, people who can just regale you for hours over a beer, and really funny people. So, it comes, sometimes it just comes from, standing in the checkout line at the Home Depot and hearing somebody say something, and I'll think, oh, totally get that. Well, a lot of it's obscene, um, but that's kind of where it comes from. So the characters, they come from everywhere, and you begin to grow them. Sometimes you can see them. Sometimes I find I can see them in my mind. Other times I can hear them in my mind. I can hear their voices or the way they speak. Or sometimes I can just, there's something that they do. There is something that comes to me, and I realize that, oh, that's what that character is completely about. And with that last piece of the puzzle, the entire picture comes into resolution, and I can see them and hear them.
Yeah. And a follow-up question of my own, I'm curious, as you said, since so many of your characters are kind of composites of people did you ever have moments either while you were drafting or once other people were reading it, people pointing out, being like, oh, this is such and so, and you just being like, no, it's not, oh my gosh, yes it is, and just being surprised at who you put into this book?
No, because I'm really careful. Most of my relatives are all still alive, so I'm really, really, really careful about putting anybody in there. And also people that you know really well, um, don't make as good characters as people you don't know all that well.
Mm-hmm.
You just have a little bit of a small insight to. Um, they're the people who give rise to a character. They're the quite often, and sometimes yes, there are people who are very similar, but eventually the story, in a certain sense, the story will take the character in a direction that the real person would never have gone in.
Yeah, a very direct example of the kind of nature versus nurture type thing, where you might take a trait of a real life human being, but you've put them in a situation that they haven't experienced, and therefore they grow in such a new way.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what happens.
We also have a question from Pamela Westcott, wondering if you could share a little bit more of how you got your first novel published, especially in the year of 2021. I imagine your debut experience was a little different than you had pictured.
God. Yeah, well, I'll tell you, how did I get it published? I got very lucky. And I mean, really, I did get very, very lucky. I was 59 when the book came out, and I'm 60 now. So, you know, I did this late, very, very late in life, after having had a career and raised a family and having done a lot of other things. So I guess, how did I get it published? I did an MFA because I wanted to write, and I didn't really know how to write. I'd been a business writer, so I was good at constructing short, concise, clear sentences. But that's fine, but that's not the same as this. And so I enrolled in an MFA program at NYU, which was great, and was really helpful. And they taught me how to write, which was great. And then, honestly, how did I get it published? I mean, I just got lucky. I was able to find a great agent, Stephanie Cabot, who, was willing to take me on. I mean, as a debut author of a certain age. And, with no track record, no social media platform, I'm told that really helps. I don't have one. And then, she was very thoughtful and intentional about who she approached for the book, and found Megan Lynch, who got it, who liked it, who understood it. And, so that's kind of how it happened. Having said that, I mean, yes, I have gotten very lucky, but it is all about perseverance. It is about it is taking no for an answer, but then going on and trying to get yes
Mm-hmm.
from someone else who gets it. It is a real, and it can be soul destroying, because of the volume of submissions that agents and publishers get. They can't even respond to them all. So it can be quite, it's hard. It's a really hard process for someone just starting out.
Yeah, and I think your comment too about how it's specifically the you accept the no's, but then you keep searching for your yes is something that I think is so hard to conceptualize sometimes, but is so integral to the whole idea of publishing, where it's not like, oh, just because someone says no to your story doesn't mean that your story doesn't have an audience, doesn't mean that your story doesn't have someone out there who will love it. It's just that's not the right pairing for it. And at
Right.
the end of the day, like, you want to wait for that perfect pairing, because as I'm sure your experience, when you get the right agent, when you get the right editor, they can turn your book into something that you never knew it could be. Just amazing partnerships.
Yeah, it's like Pinocchio. It's a real book.
It's a real book. Um, I do think it's interesting too to hear you talk about how your previous writing experience, it was short, concise sentences. I wonder how much that led to the fact that your novel was more of a novel in stories, because you had this experience being like, okay, I know how to dive into this scene. I know how to convey this moment. I know how to get these details across.
Yeah, it might have been. It certainly might have been part of it. I think I like the short story as a form. I really do like it. I like writing a short story. And the short story feels quite natural to me. Um, it's a comfortable form. And I like, and the other thing is, I am good at writing short, concise sentences explaining to you, how your overdraft protection works. But the idea of then taking those small pieces and stitching them together, and taking those short sentences and elongating them and pulling them and extending them in a way that drives the story forward, is the other part of that's really interesting. That's different and interesting.
Yeah, I feel like people who have experiencing in writing in a different format, when they move to fiction, it gives them such a distinctive kind of flair to it. And knowing the context of your background and your work, I can see how that influences your writing in a really neat way.
Thanks.
Peter Monroe was wondering, do you have any particular technique for hearing your characters speak in conversation with one another? I wonder if that ties into what you had said before about how you kind of overhear conversations.
Yeah. Sometimes, well, it's really important the way people talk to each other. It's really, really critical. I mean, what people say is important, but what they say to each other and the way they say it and who they say it to, that's all really, really important. And sometimes I just let them talk.
Mhm.
I mean, and then I go back and edit half of it out. And the other thing about the way people talk is quite often what they don't say is as important as what they do say. The question they don't answer is as important as the answer that they might give. And that's important to hear and bear in mind.
Yeah, and I can see how that ties back into what you were saying about how you are so much more interested in why people are doing things than what they're doing, that what is left unsaid versus what is said. And I think that ties back to, once again, what you're talking about, even in terms of Lillian's name, like the way that you talk about people to other people, I think really does says a lot. We also have a question from Audrey Winslow saying that in the audiobook, the narrator is a man. Why was he chosen, and why a woman narrator for the last chapter? I know for some authors, they don't have a lot of direct influence with audiobooks, but what was your experience with that?
Yeah, Macmillan Audiobooks was fantastic. They are an amazing group of people to work with. And I had really thought it would be a woman, but I listened to a lot of demos from women and I didn't find the voice that really spoke to me. And then I heard this man and he sounded a little bit like E.B. White. And if you've ever heard the E.B. White, E.B. White reading Charlotte's Web, you'll know exactly what that is. There's a cadence and a roundness and a rolling sort of softness, but also grit in that. And I heard that voice and I really loved it. And I thought, maybe that is something that would be a little bit different. But then we got to the final chapter in the book, which is one of the very few first person accounts in the book. There isn't a lot of first person I. And I felt like that needed to be a woman because the speaker was a woman. But also, I felt like there was a need to show the break with the past, to show that things had changed, and that for this woman, this character, who happens to be Lillian's daughter, it was really important to make a break with the past. That was important, and I felt like, oh well, that would be a really interesting way to do that. Is
Yeah,
to have the woman read the last one.
and I think especially because, as you had said, and it's definitely evident while reading it, there are so many strong female characters throughout the book. The fact that a male narrator's voice ended up resonating with you, I don't know if it necessarily says anything, but I just think it's interesting, that kind of maybe unexpected parallel. Well, I do notice that we're starting to get towards 7 o'clock. So I kind of just wanted to open up to you. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about your book that we didn't get to bring up? Anything that you were excited to share?
Um, no, I think that covers everything. I'm just grateful to be able to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, and it's really exciting to be able to hear you share about it. You can definitely tell how much you care about this place that you built and the characters who live there. I kind of wonder, do you still find yourself sometimes that like, oh, like there's Lillian's voice again, there's George's voice again. Do you ever feel like those characters have anything more to say, or do you kind of feel like you've told their stories?
No, they do have a lot more to say, and in fact, I'm working on the second book, which is the backstory to one of the chapters, the chapter called Trinity, and it's that backstory. And there are some characters I'd like to hear a little bit more from, primarily the character of Myra Moody, but and there's some new ones that I'm getting a handle on some characters I really like. And yeah, so there's a little bit more to say. I think this second book, if it comes to be, will be it's a different form. It's more of a call and response kind of a form, but it's very there's one character at the center, and it's single character focus. So see how that goes. See if I can do it.
Oh, exciting. So what is the best way for people to stay up to date on what's going on in your world and in your writing?
Sure. I have a website, wswinslow.com, that has links to events. And I think through social media is a good way to do it. I have an Instagram account, um, at WS Winslow, I think. I have Instagram and, Twitter and all the rest. But my website is good because I do update it with events and links, and so you can see previous events. There are links to future events, and hopefully it'll be up there when the paperback comes out in a little while.
Yeah, and I just dropped in the chat as well a link to Wendy's website as well as her Twitter page. So make sure you check out both of those places to keep up to date on everything that's going on. Thank you again for being here tonight, both Wendy and our wonderful audience. It's always a great way to spend an evening.
All right, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you guys. Thank you all for coming. I can't see you, but I know you're there. But thank you all. Thank you, and thank you to Boston.com. What a wonderful thing it is to have you pick my book. And I hope you will all come to Maine. All of you who are reading it, don't be afraid. It's delightful summer.
Have a good evening, everybody.